Welcome to Hence the Future podcast. I'm Mattimore Cronin.
I'm Michael Kipp.
And today we're discussing the future of knowledge. That means we'll get into how scientific knowledge is discovered, how it's disseminated, and how it's absorbed or not absorbed by the public. We'll also discuss misinformation, conspiracy theories, and the role that science currently plays, as well as the role that it should play within the competitive attention economy. And for those of you who don't know, Michael Kipp is a postdoctoral scholar of geochemistry at the California Institute of Technology, and he also heads up our research team at Hence the Future. Today he will be giving his personal thoughts on knowledge, so not along the lines of any organizations he's associated with. And to start, Kipp, perhaps you can tell our listeners about your recent trip to India and the need for reliable, up-to-date information about travel and risks amidst the coronavirus, and maybe how that ties into knowledge.
So I'm sitting here talking to you from Los Angeles on March 8th. But if you'd asked me months ago what I'd be doing right now, I would have told you I'd be in the field in India. And obviously I'm not. And this is related to this coronavirus outbreak. So I was recently just in the midst of making these plans to go on this field trip. It's been over a year at this point that this has been in the works. There was a conference that I was going to be attending as well. And as this epidemic and I guess coronavirus outbreak has spread, I found myself in critical need of accurate information on a day-to-day basis of what is going to happen to travelers. Are you going to get quarantined? Are you going to get detained and tested? And all of these things, are you going to get held up in some random airport for 14 days or 28 days or something? This was.
And you had a wedding to get back to, so it's not like you could just delay your trip by 2 weeks or 3 weeks.
Yes, which is another particularly interesting thing of the timing of all of this. I didn't have any time to spare here. And what it really, the thought that crystallized in my mind then is that what I'm relying on or in search of here is quality information, scientific information in many cases. So what is the latest data we're getting from this outbreak? What are the number of cases? How severe is the illness? Or even more on the social science side, what are the different countries doing to combat this, and what are their policies for international travelers? And it really shocked me when I was on the hunt for this information, how much noise there is out there, how much you have to sift through basically to get the quality information or just the answers to your questions. So I think, that's really primed me a bit for thinking about all these topics.
Yeah, it's interesting because when people talk about the attention economy, it really does operate in a similar way to the normal economy in the sense that there's supply and demand. And when something like a global pandemic occurs, the demand for information about the pandemic skyrockets. And then as a result, the supply of information will also skyrocket. But oftentimes, especially in a case where it's a new virus, there's so much we don't know, the information quality ends up being fairly low because people are just giving their gut reaction to what they think is causing the virus, what they think are going to be the repercussions of the virus. And so you end up having to sift through so much unqualified information to find actual quality sources from people like Trevor Bedford, who, maybe you can say a bit more about how you discovered him, because you were the one who actually told me about his work. And he's one of the few reliable sources on this because he's been studying coronaviruses for the bulk of his career. And he basically went from having, a few thousand Twitter followers to a few 100,000 Twitter followers in a matter of weeks, just because there was such a need for reliable information from someone like him.
Yeah, I think one theme I've been alerted to during this is that you can be the scientist on the front lines doing some research about a timely topic, in this case a virus that's spreading across the world, that we need to be doing things like testing people for the virus, figuring out using these genomic tools like that group you're referencing does, and doing some modeling to figure out how early did this outbreak sort of have its root? How far is it spread? Projecting how many cases are in different places based on the limited data we get. You can be doing all of that careful work and also be the person or one of the people broadcasting that information to the public. That's not something you often see in the scientific world. There's this pretty serious gap, I would say, between the doing of science and the communicating of it. At best, scientists often are communicating their results in a scholarly format, be it at a conference presentation or in a published article that's peer-reviewed. We tend to be, myself definitely included, a little more shy when it comes to just speaking to the general public in real time, especially about things that are as yet to be peer-reviewed. But in this case, the social good is at stake. And so this case, like you mentioned, this Twitter account that I started following for the highest quality information I could come across about the spread of the virus, was run by Trevor Bedford, a scientist at the Fred Hutch Institute in Seattle. I hope I got the name of that right, but he's also affiliated with the UW, and they're doing some really cool stuff. They study viral evolution in different contexts, and right now they're jumping on this coronavirus case, and he's been live tweeting really high quality information, basically laying bare his thought process to the people, which is really, I think, the most useful thing, more than any fact sharing. He's walking through dissecting complex points in a literally bite-sized, tweet-sized units of information. And I think it's a great model to follow for other fields and other times when some other timely issue will require the input of a scientist.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And when we think about what knowledge is, it's information that's processed, right? And typically what happens is you have scientists doing the fundamental research work, but then someone else transmits the information to the public. Like typically it's a newscaster or some media outlet that will, everyone's seen a million morning news shows where they're like, new study finds that drinking a glass of wine may actually be the equivalent of working out for 1 hour at the gym. Like that was a real news segment, which, obviously is pretty absurd when you think of it. And, there have been other studies that are even more ridiculous where they'll say like, it's actually bad to hug your dog, or like coffee cures cancer, or like and maybe some of these have some truth to them, but they get so sensationalized in the media that it's hard to really trust the information. And when you have a one-to-one connection with the actual guy who's doing the research, you tend to be able to have much more trust in it, because it's not some game of telephone where you have so many intermediaries between the person doing the work and the person absorbing the knowledge. So maybe you can say a little bit about what's the current process for getting scientific knowledge into the world, and what are some of the vulnerabilities of that current process?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to take this discussion. So the sort of status quo of generating scientific information and disseminating it to the world at large is that, let's say you do an experiment, you make some observations, you collect a bunch of data, you pull it all together, you're doing the scientific method in some format, and you find something out. You want to tell people about it. Most immediately, you probably need to tell the people in your field about it. They need to know that, oh, this has been found. It will adjust what you're working on. So the traditional format, the unit at which we do this, is a peer-reviewed publication. That's basically the unit of scientific information these days. It has been for centuries at this point. The way that you get your unit of your publication, let's say you write up a paper, you've got your the background so people know what you're talking about. You list the methods you use, the data that you obtained, some interpretations in the discussion at the end. You package that all up. You've got some figures that tell the story. That gets sent out to experts in your field. This is the process that we call peer review. They may be people they may be people and you like. You may know that they don't like you. It's an imperfect process. There's all sorts of human interaction going into it. But I would say by and large, overall, these papers are getting into the hands of informed experts, I'd say on average. So it really is reviewed by your peers. And you'll typically have a handful, anywhere between two and a few, 4 or 5 people looking at a paper, being as critical as they possibly can, trying to basically say, what are the holes in this? Does it actually stand up? And there's some back and forth. You'll often have to revise a paper in response to some comments of these reviewers. But if you eventually please all of them that you've done enough to say this is solid, it has addressed its shortcomings, and it lays bare the assumptions and all of the things that it cannot tell us, it then will get published in a journal, some varying format, which is then the format in which the people, whether they're in the scientific world or whether they're in the general public, are supposed to be able to access the information. That's sort of where, I wouldn't say where it stops. You also sort of in parallel have often people, scientists will be broadcasting their work by giving talks at conferences or by giving seminars at research institutes. But these are all ways of scientists basically talking to each other. What it doesn't account for then is getting that information to the general public. So I would say that is, maybe one thing we could focus on here, unless you want to discuss any more about the way that process actually goes of defining what is.
Well, I think it's
true. What is?
Yeah. So I think it's important to also note the timeline. Like, how long does it typically take peer review? Is it a matter of months, a matter of years? Like, what's the time scale we're dealing with?
Quite variable. So if you've got something that is of timely, urgent interest, then you have reason to say it should be rushed through the publication process. You are then looking at best on the timescale of weeks. You could maybe get a response within a few weeks, 2 to 6, and then even in the best case, that's getting the review back. Let's say it was even extremely positive, you still probably have to change something, and then if it gets accepted, it has to go into print, and so you're still looking at a few months at the absolute fastest, and it's often more in the several months range and can not infrequently spill over into a year or two. From the time that's not the beginning of a project to being published. That's from the time when you said the project is done, I know the results, here's the paper. And the time that it takes for that paper to end up as official, published, and printed can be easily a year or two.
Right. And in the course of something like the coronavirus, a matter of weeks is like a lifetime for the way that it spreads.
Yeah. So it's definitely not as amenable to that.
Right. So I guess just to list like some of the vulnerabilities before we get into what would perhaps be a way to improve the process. So one is obviously it takes a lot of time, and part of that's necessary. We really want high quality information in the world, especially scientific information, because it oftentimes serves as the bedrock that then results in media outlets creating their stories, the public coming up with how they're going to process the information and how they're going to change their own life in response to that information. So we want high quality sources, but it takes a lot of time. The other vulnerability that I see right off the bat is that there's an asymmetry between, let's say someone like Donald Trump and someone who's like a respected researcher, in the sense that the former can be much more sensational and can immediately, with the push of a button, reach millions of people with information that is completely unverified, whereas the people who actually have the knowledge, oftentimes it takes so much, back and forth and rigor among their peers before you can really get that out into the world, except in the few cases where you have someone like Bedford who's willing to actually engage with the public in real time over Twitter. Some other vulnerabilities that I'm interested if you have any thoughts on, but one is obviously some research studies are funded by organizations that have an agenda. Like, for instance, I saw one study that was reported in some morning show that said that dehydrated driving is actually just as dangerous as drunk driving. And it was a study done by 12 men. There was no control group, and it was funded by Coca-Cola. And so, but they didn't say any of that in the news broadcast. And of course, some studies, even if they are funded by a group that has special interest, they can still be really good studies because it totally depends on individual scientists and where their moral codes are. But it's something that should be said, right? Yeah, I'll just name one more vulnerability that I've noticed, and that is that there's also a lack of reproducing the studies. So essentially, from my perspective, a scientific research paper, one of the main purposes of it is to actually create a blueprint so that anyone else can reproduce the study and come up with their own results and see if those results match the original results. But one of the major problems is that so rarely do studies that are for reproducing results get funded, because there's not really much of an incentive to be the second person to discover something, or to find out that some study that purported that acai berries help you live longer and be happier and be more sexually, vigorous, or whatever the study is, that's actually not true. There's no real glory in disproving someone else's study, especially if it takes a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of effort to reproduce that study. So it seems to me, and maybe I'm misguided in my interpretation, but it seems like a lot of the peer review process is just like, oh yeah, that sounds about right. Rather than actually reproducing the study and being like, oh yes, I got the same exact results. This is valid. So I'm interested to hear
Yeah,
your feedback on those vulnerabilities.
I think those are great takes. And really, I see one theme tying all of them together, or tying a solution to all of them together. And that, I would say, is transparency in the reporting of scientific information and in the publishing of scientific information. And what I mean by that is, let's say you take a more traditional journal article of the sort that still exists today for sure, but that existed decades ago. This is coming out in print in a journal, like a magazine that you will open, you'll read, you'll see the title, you'll see the text, the figures. It's presented as fact. You read the report and you're like, this made it in the journal. It has been approved. It is the stamp of peer review as its approval. At the end, you might see a little bit in the acknowledgments where it would say something like, we thank 3 anonymous reviewers for their contributions. They made some comments that really improved the paper. Occasionally mentioning by name. Sometimes reviewers reveal it's often a blind process by default that you can always give your name, and if you really help the paper out, sometimes people divulge that information. So they'll say, thanks to so-and-so, your comments really helped. That's about all of you have to work with, though, a lot of the time. And so you're left saying, okay, well, this one made it through. It must be true. Or if you take it a level of sophistication higher, you read it with a critical eye, and with some background knowledge of the subject, where you come to your own conclusion, basically doing your own peer review. Now, that alone, that's a very difficult thing, even if you're an expert in a given field. And there's so much nuance. You need to spend so much time reading a paper to do that. Now, there's a different way of publishing this same sort of article that we're starting to see, I think, spread in its popularity. And it's being used by a lot of the same publishing outlets. I think you're starting to phase it in piecemeal here and there. And it's basically taking every piece of that process, but making it a bit more transparent. So starting with the reporting of the results, you see, I would say, in recent papers, a lot more detail given to methodological details. Like you're saying, this can help the reproducibility problem. You see more and more recent papers, and the ones that are doing it well, really getting closer to that lab manual level of detail, so that one could reproduce the experiment. And whether that's in the main text or in a supplement or now in an online appendix or something, it doesn't really matter. Now it's actually, I think, becoming quite useful. We can not have to jam all of this complex information into your article text. You can have this online supplement. You can share, for instance, your code if you're doing some modeling. And a lot of this now, scientists are making open source. You can go on their website after the paper's published, download the code, run the same simulation they did. It gives you the result. They didn't make up the output. So that's one level of transparency. I think it's really good. It also fosters Just more, I don't know, scientific progress, I guess, overall. If you're going to share your model code and someone else can do something else with it and figure out something new.
And they'll
Um,
actually include the data sets, like an Excel file or something like
whether,
that.
yeah, it's actually a lot of publishers now. I've seen this even just in the last few years. Journals or publishers, of which they run multiple journals sometimes, but certain publishers now are requiring that you before you submit a manuscript to them, you must prove that your data is going to be publicly available. You either are attaching the file as a text or Excel or whatever CSV, but you're
Mm.
attaching your data file in raw form to the submission, or you have to give them a link showing it's already uploaded online in some database. So that's a huge development already that, again, on the timescale of years right now is gaining popularity. The transparency can continue, though. It's not just for the reporting of the information by the scientists. It's also about the process of the peer review and the publishing. Because you could, again, imagine in these papers, let's say that when you're reading your print journal, you see a paper that made it through peer review by 3 anonymous reviewers. It's received the stamp of approval. It is fact now. You don't know what the peer reviewer said, and
Mm.
they may have been highly critical of it, but there, for some reason, may have been an editor who decided that this paper is worth publishing because the editor knows one of the authors, or the editor thought it was just particularly interesting, or vice versa,
Yeah.
where the editor may have put the kibosh on a paper despite it having positive reviews, or there may have been a split review. You may have had some reviewers liked it, some were very critical, and one tipped the scales. And so there's not just a binary. It's yes and no. And so
Right.
what I think is a great trend that I'm seeing now, more and more journals starting to incorporate, is that they actually publish the entire peer review report alongside the article. So
Mm.
you see exactly what each of these reviewers said about that paper. You see all of their critical analysis. And so you're reading it not just with the content of the scientific report. You're seeing, oh, this is what 3 experts had to say about it, given the chance to be critical. Um, and that is something that I was pointing out to you. We were seeing happening in this Twitter thread that Trevor Bedford was running. I really liked that he was doing that. He's basically doing a public peer review of some of these reports that are coming out. I think
Yeah.
that's the most useful thing of all. You're laying bare the thought process behind all of this, not just the facts that can very quickly get quoted, misquoted, shared, clickbait going viral, and all of a sudden you think you get some game of telephone going and there's some awful information getting spread. So sharing that thought process, I think, is critical.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I mean, it's the most worrisome thing to me is that people will just stop trusting scientific information because there is so much conflicting information and people are just sort of cherry picking data. And it's like, there was this great documentary called Merchants of Doubt, and they basically go through, how was the tobacco industry able to survive for so long when doctors and scientists basically knew with certainty that this causes cancer and people are dying. And the whole way that they were able to stick around is just by casting doubt, by basically saying, well, everything causes cancer. Here's a study that says driving causes cancer. Here's a study that says being outside causes cancer. So just live your life. And that sort of mentality leads the public to feel like, oh, science is just whatever you want it to be. Like, my opinion is just as good as any scientist's opinion. And you see that sort of attitude with things like global climate change, where everyone feels like they're their own expert and they can say, well, do we really know? And they can cast doubt. It's all about casting doubt. But when there's a real disparity between scientists who are doubtful themselves, as they should be by their very nature, as opposed to some, people who have a real agenda, who are paid lobbyists, whether it's the tobacco industry or the big oil industry or whatever it is, who are just so certain about their take on a situation, then you leave people with just not knowing what to believe, and they kind of feel like, well, it's choose your own reality. Like, that my opinion is just as good as any scientist's. So I'm wondering if you have any ideas for how we can get past that. I mean, is it all just about being more transparent, having more direct communication with scientists? Like, I almost wonder if there's some tech solution where you could, once you create a certain research report and you have all the data and everything, maybe like some AI lab can just automatically like do a reproducibility study, maybe with some human input as well. Or maybe there could be some AI that like real time fact checks the news and information during a debate. Or, maybe on Twitter, there's like when someone tweets, yes, it can still be out there in the public, but maybe it gets like a little rating of like how true or incorrect is it. Um, so I'd like to get your thoughts on that if you have any takes, and then maybe we can talk about just a few of the conspiracy theories around the coronavirus, because it really gives you insight into why people want to believe certain things, even though there's not necessarily evidence for them. But first, I don't know if you have any thoughts on like, potential AI solution or any way that we can, real time fact check or, real time do reproducibility studies.
Yeah, I mean, definitely venturing into a world that I do not have the grasp of to say the feasibility of, say, this, an AI level fact checking system. But in principle, for things that are, a paper that's based on a mathematical foundation, a modeling study, that
Hmm.
sort of thing would definitely lend itself to fact checking by some sort of algorithm. It would definitely be trickier, I mean, if not impossible, with a lot of the laboratory or human trial cases that already just the trouble of amassing enough data from, let's say you need to do some drug trial and you need to be tracking people over years in some cases, and you get an extremely imperfect data set out of that.
Hmm.
And then the time scale on which you could reproduce that, I mean, you need an answer sooner than that. Yes, I'm definitely all in favor of making it more of a norm to fund that sort of work, because there is this sort of reproducibility crisis that people are rightly worried about in the science world. But some things would be definitely harder to
Hmm.
have
Because
a quick solution for.
right, because it seems to me like this is a problem that is new in regards to science, but it's not new in regards to social media. Like the problem of actually finding out, is this information accurate or not. So it seems to me like there are basically three ways that information is validated, and that's either hiring a bunch of moderators who know what to look for. That's what Facebook does right now in their battle against misinformation. Or you could crowdsource fact checking, which is basically what Twitter does right now, where if someone says something totally false, you've got a bunch of replies, hopefully debunking that claim. And then you have some sort of algorithmic fact checking mechanism, which no one's really cracked the code on yet. I mean, they do use this somewhat in Facebook. Like, for instance, they have AIs that can see, is this video sexually explicit? Is this video, have violence that's like real world violence? And then a moderator will basically look into it and confirm whether or not that's the case. But I don't know if there's any other ways we could combat it. So it seems to me like the most promising would be some combination of the three.
Yeah, at least on the large scale, again. So, I mean, when you're considering the volume of information moving through a Facebook or a Twitter compared to the volume of information moving through a scientific journal,
Hmm.
you simply cannot, hire enough people, have enough man hours to moderate all of the content going up on those social media platforms. But you can carefully curate and it does happen. I mean, the way it works in the science publishing world is that everything is so carefully curated,
Hmm.
that there is no, you're not getting some uh, viral meme making it through the peer review process. I mean, there's
Right.
definitely a range of quality of articles, but that's maybe one extreme in terms of vetting. Uh, but I think for having some place that you can go to that is the most reliable, basically like a something that if you need the answer to a question, you can trust it all the way through. I think on that extreme, you need to have the approach of we vet things to,
Hmm.
with a person looking it over before it can see the light of day, basically. I think you need
Right.
a harder cap on the information sharing than we see with Twitter, for instance.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about that is that I've seen multiple people on Twitter talk about how it's not CNN or MSNBC or Fox or whatever where they get their information that they really trust. It's just a few people they follow on Twitter or on YouTube that they trust because they've built up that relationship with them over time and they've found their information to be accurate. So we're seeing sort of a move away from the Walter Cronkite world where his word is God to more of a world where it's like everyone's got their own YouTube star or Twitter personality that they sort of depend on for reliable information, and it has upsides and downsides, but it's just an interesting way that the whole field of information is changing. And I want to remark on something else about the whole viral meme aspect to it, which is that it's not always the most reliable information that rises to the top. Oftentimes, it's the stickiest information, the information that you wish were true or that you could so easily imagine being true that your mind just wraps itself around it and just takes it to be fact. And so this has definitely been the case in the coronavirus situation, where I'll just list a few of the conspiracy theories because it's fun. So the first one is that it's a bioweapon intentionally released by China. Now, there is some interesting circumstantial evidence for this just because there does happen to be a top tier, biochemical weapon research facility in Wuhan, which was sort of the spark of that initial theory. But it's obviously, if it was intentional, it has totally backfired because this has not been good PR for China. It's been terrible for their economy. So it seems kind of ridiculous to think that this was intentional, just given how it's turning out for them. But you can see why someone who thinks like China is evil, they only do evil things, if you have that mindset, it's super easy to also take the leap and say, oh, well, they obviously must have released this as an intentional bioweapon. Another conspiracy theory I've seen online is that 5G is increasing the risk of coronavirus, and it actually may be spreading the virus itself, and which is just totally ridiculous and has been debunked. But if you're someone who just is a technophobe, like you're really afraid of new technology and you've already bought into how big of a concern 5G really is for your health and everything, it's really easy to make that leap, to think that 5G must be part of this coronavirus scare. So that's also a confirmation bias. Another one, which is more on the far right, so Rush Limbaugh in the U.S. says that the coronavirus was being weaponized as yet another element to bring Trump down. So that's like, they thought that this was all, of course, it's all just some scheme from the liberals who want to take him down. I could go on. I literally have like a list of all these conspiracy theories, but the interesting thing to me is just acknowledging how big of a role confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance play with any sort of viral meme. So I don't know what the possible solution is to this, but it does seem worth noting that, it can't just be a boring piece of information if it's going to get spread. It has to have some sort of hook to it for people to actually remember it. And, they've used this for good causes too. Like, for instance, click it or ticket is a good way to remember that you need to put on your seatbelt every time or you'll get a ticket. So you can use like sort of mnemonics and stuff like that, which is interesting. But I guess one other thing I'll say, and then I'll get your reaction, is that I saw this video from Kurzgesagt where they say that one great way to tell if a conspiracy theory is true or false is just to think, is this something that also affects rich people? And if so, then it's probably not true, right? So for instance, chemtrails, this is one of the most longest lasting conspiracy theories that still has a lot of proponents. And this is the idea that when you see planes flying across the sky and they release clouds, that it's actually some sort of chemicals that are meant to somehow like control us psychologically or damage us or make us infertile, or there's all different variations of this. But if you just ask the question, okay, but do rich people and powerful people breathe the same air as us? Yes. Okay. Probably not true then, right? Or another one is like that there's a conspiracy that there is a cure for cancer, but big pharma is holding back because they make so much money on us. But then you can just ask, okay, do rich people get cancer? Yes, they do. So that's probably not a true theory. And same thing with the coronavirus, where it's like, okay, if you think this was intentionally released by China, okay, are people in, are wealthy people, powerful people still dying from the coronavirus? Yes, like there's like, you know, top officials in Iran that are dying from it. Even though it's may not have hit top Chinese officials, it's definitely bad for people like President Xi who are trying to keep everything under control and keep China in a good light as far as how the global community of countries see it. So I thought that was an interesting way to sort of determine, whether or not a conspiracy theory is true. But yeah, interested to hear if you have any reactions or any ideas for how we can make reliable information somewhere near as popular as unreliable conspiracy theories.
Well, I think unfortunately, I have to say that the same sorts of principles apply within the scientific world as we try to deem what is more reliable, what is more true, what is a more robust theory. The sticky stuff, the stuff you want to be true, often gets more citations, often spends more time being discussed at conferences, often becomes the sort of the paradigm. There's a quote that I love. It goes something along the lines of the eminence of a scientist is measured by the length of time that he or she holds up progress in their field. Because everyone thinks, oh, this person said it, and it must be right, that they really know what they're talking about. Right. And that paradigm becomes so difficult to overturn, basically. So the same sorts of principles apply. And so unfortunately, what I think it means in general is that it's the harder thing to do is to get at the core of what's more accurate, what's the real picture, what is the messy underlying detail, and what's not just a sensational tidbit. It's a skill set that one can hone, and that applies to literally every sort of situation you could come across in your life. And so if I just had to, instead of explaining everything I think that ought to go into that, I would just have to cite one work that has influenced my thinking on that more than anything else. It's Carl Sagan's book, The Demon Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. He outlines all sorts of case studies about things that are, funny cases about his chapters on UFOs and why did all sorts of reports of people being abducted come along shortly after all sorts of movie releases about aliens, and just really debunks a lot of things. And then in one chapter, if you only had to read one chapter of the whole thing, he has one where he calls it the fine art of baloney detection. He has this baloney detection kit. It's a series of, like you were saying, the little shorthand, way of thinking about the conspiracy theories. Does it affect rich people? He's got some more, distilled wisdom of the sort of saying, for instance, don't trust arguments from authority, or, some logical.
Right. Like, look, I am the director of this. Like, your argument should stand in its own right.
Yeah, and things that you can, once you, read that and then go pick up a newspaper or something, you'll notice all sorts of these things being, these rhetorical devices being used consciously or not, because they're effective. And we, sometimes it's really something, I think it's a constant training and reminding of your brain. So I never, discount. I understand how people end up in these situations, and it happens to all of us. And you really need to stay on top of making the effort to carefully digest information. But it's a skill you can definitely
Yeah, like
development.
I was watching a newscast the other day, and basically they had an official from the White House answering questions about the coronavirus, and one of the reporters pointed out that the U.S. doesn't even know how many tests we've done. Whereas if you look at South Korea or Singapore, they know exactly how many tests they've run. They have really good data. They know the rate of infection, the rate of severe cases, the rate of death. Whereas the US seems really sort of far behind on it. So a journalist was asking, like, how many tests have been run? Like, do we know the numbers? And rather than actually answering the question and admitting that, we might not have our act together as much as some of these other countries, the representative basically did the high ground maneuver. And the high ground maneuver is not answering the question, but taking a high ground. He said something along the lines of right now, while you are focusing in the details, we're focused on saving American lives. Like, that's what we care about. We're going to get as many tests done as we can. We're going to do the best job we can. And that is a super effective tactic in any sort of debate or persuasive context. But it's like totally avoiding the actual question at hand or the actual facts on the ground. So yeah, I see that time and time again. But if you aren't trained to see those sorts of tactics, then you can very easily just be convinced by it and not even realize that someone just pulled a fast one on you.
Absolutely, and I think it's even easier for that to happen in the real time human to human interactions that are the sort of, say, a political speech or a debate or even just a conversation or someone going on the news. Something, I don't know, about just the way that we are used to interacting with people. You're kind of on autopilot. You're reading their emotions, their body language, and to be doing all of these things and also doing this like rigorous fact checking in your head, there's a certain error rate. You're going to miss some things. It's part of why I guess a useful thing that's coming out of, say, the way that the social media world is operating, like you were saying before, basically crowdsourcing fact checking. You may have missed something despite your best efforts, but someone else may have caught it. And
Hmm.
if that voice ends up getting, however, voted up, gets enough retweets, whatever platform you're on, getting to the people, then that's great. That means that one person needed to see it, and everyone can benefit from that. Um, so there's an element to which the numbers game can help there.
Yeah, definitely. Although I thought it was interesting that Apple just came out with a statement that they are not allowing any new apps in the App Store about the coronavirus unless they're from a reputable organization like the World Health Organization or the CDC. And there were actually some really good apps that got submitted that use reliable publicly available information, but because they weren't associated with a reputable organization, they did not get approved. So I thought that was interesting because it was sort of an argument for authority over just the
Hmm.
reliability of the information itself. And I feel like
Hmm.
maybe when something's this important, they figured, why risk it? Like they don't really have the infrastructure to know if every single app is using reliable information. So they're better off just going with the known entities that, deal with this stuff all the time.
Yeah, that's a tough case. I would definitely say that the highest, the ideal situation there is one where you do not need to be imposed. You don't want to see this authority uh, or legitimacy basically decided from some single entity, be it Apple in that case. You want it to basically go to the people, the market, whatever the facts should hopefully be. Again, yeah, selected for, crowdsourced, whatever. But obviously that doesn't always work. And in this case, when even if it were to get to that point eventually, where the scammy ones and the fake news apps would eventually get shut down. I mean, when there's enough on the line that you can't risk that happening on a day-to-day basis and you can't keep up with monitoring, that's a tricky
Mm,
situation. So I can't say I know the best option for it, but it's an interesting
right.
point.
Plus, there's no review process for websites. So anyone can make a website with whatever information and it can get traction. And yeah. Well, I think now would be a good time to take a quick break and then get into the future scenarios. All right, Kip, what is your worst case scenario for the future of knowledge?
Worst case scenario.
Worst case. In this instance, I think I can imagine a few different directions that would be quite bad, but different flavors, different ways of panning out. So one that would be very bad um, is one in which the noise in the system, be it on Twitter, be it even in the publishing world, if the low quality information becomes of such high quantity that you cannot sift through it all and get to the high quality information, that's basically a world where, yeah, be it like this sowing of doubt deliberately, or be it just white noise of nonsense. It's a scary world when you can't either access what's true, or you cease to be able to figure out what is true about a certain topic. That's a pretty bad case that I could imagine. The only maybe worse case than that, or I don't know that it's necessarily worse, it's just a different way of going. That one is like we evolve ourselves into that sort of system accidentally, and it's really not great. But maybe a different flavor of worse is some authoritarian entity, some government group, some special interest, some company, basically having the power to control selectively the information that people can access, and in doing so can basically set up truth and falsehood for huge chunks of the population. That's a very scary world to live in too. And unfortunately, you can see the steps that separate us from each of those, pretty well delineated. It's plausible. So
yeah,
that's what I'm thinking. But what about you?
I had very similar ones. I also agree that we are in the quote information explosion right now, and it's hard to know exactly what the rate is, but I've seen people say things like every month more information is created than all history's information combined, just because we are literally in an information explosion. When you think about how many new tweets and pictures and just everything that goes out every moment compared to history, where you actually had to write something down, spend the time copying from one book to another. It had to be of a certain quality that it was worth it to do that. And just the nature of information, as it explodes in quantity, it gets harder and harder to sift through that information. So I think unless there is a lot of conscious work done to make the reliable information rise to the top, then the default outcome is that it's just hard to figure out what's the real. And you can have a situation that we're kind of already in, which is choose your own reality, choose who you want to believe. Everyone's opinion is just as good as anyone else's. And that's a really scary place to be, especially when you're dealing with a real situation, whether it's the real threat of nuclear war, or the real threat of a pandemic, or the real threat of an asteroid hitting Earth. If you can't agree on the basic physics of when it's going to happen, how bad it's going to be, what to do, what could potentially prevent it, then it's really hard to take steps to counteract whatever the current danger is. So I think that's a big threat, especially in a democratic system like America, which really values freedom of speech. And freedom of speech often sort of sneaks in freedom to be a total moron and manipulate people and spout disinformation, unfortunately. Although I think free speech is super valuable, so it's almost would rather have that than not let anyone speak their mind. And that's what on the other side of the spectrum is exactly that, not letting anyone speak their mind and basically having a top-down control over what the approved facts are. And we did see that a little bit in China, where that doctor who went viral for saying that the pandemic was actually worse than the authorities were letting on, he got silenced. And so that is a major problem in China, as opposed to the problem of just like everyone being their own expert in the US. So I do think we have to consider both of those as potentially really bad worst case scenarios. What do you think for the best case scenario?
Best case scenario.
So in the best case, I would have to say, inspired a bit by what your ideas were of some sort of, algorithmic fact-checking AI sort of system. I would say in the best of possible cases, we attain some sort of ability, much better than we have right now, to assess the quality of information, or at least track the origin of it. I think it's going to continue to always be hard to quantify the truth or falsehood or the robustness of any given tidbit of information, but to at least in real time track the sources for things, or the underlying basis, the data, or just the quotation for a certain something that's being shared, and somehow embed that so that when things are being shared, you're not able to just clip the piece that you want and then you get this game of telephone going. But if there's some more traceability, so that you can more easily see the unit that's been shared to you, and then see where it actually is coming from. In the context of the social media world, I've got to think the toolkit exists for something along those lines. I don't have an immediate, and as far as, well, it's a slightly different aspect of all of this, but in the specific instance of publishing scientific information, I think again the transparency trend taken to its fullest would mean that you are basically seeing the full thought process of the scientists doing the work, the full thought process of the people evaluating the work, and that is ideally conveyed in a format that's extremely accessible, so that there's no ambiguity, so that instead of basically getting sort of analogous to the social media case, facts given to you that this one is true, this one is not, you're given this spectrum of information. You've got this takeaway point of like, this is what we think, but it's tracked. You can trace this whole process of this is what it's built upon. And the fact that we're not limited now to the number of pages that you publish in a journal, in terms of space, the fact that you can upload whole data sets, share whole models on the internet, we absolutely have the ability to start doing that. So those are at least the trends that I would envision.
Totally.
But,
Yeah. I mean, my best case scenario is similar in that the high quality information is able to rise to the top. And I think that's only possible if scientific information becomes near instantaneous, because nature abhors a vacuum, and whenever there's not reliable information on a topic, people will fill in that vacuum with whatever they think should be true. So if there is a way to have sort of real-time reliable information, that would be my best case scenario. And it's hard to imagine how that would happen without some algorithmic component to it. Although I would say that I guess another way that it could rise to the top is if the role of a scientist sort of changes, where it's not just about scientists talking to each other and it's like, well, someone else will deal with the public and disseminating it to the public. But if scientists actually become almost like their own media outlet, like every scientist has his own Twitter channel, his own YouTube channel, and maybe we can make the incentives such that if you have the most reputable information, like there's some incentive for you to do that, along the lines of reproducibility studies as well. Like if we incentivize people to really fact check, and at the same time they're able to make one-to-one connections with the public, then that would be at least give us some chance in the fight against misinformation for people who just say whatever is the most viral, right?
I think that's a great point. I do want to, double down on that. I think we absolutely do not have that as a norm right now in the scientific world. It's almost sort of in an unspoken way. I wouldn't say frowned upon, just viewed as less important than spending your time just doing more science. There's sort of this, glorification of just uncovering the fundamental, nature of the cosmos. It's just this noble pursuit. But what are you're living off in your ivory tower if you're not actually taking the time to relay the findings that you found out because they were funded by usually public money, usually coming from taxpayer dollars. And if you're stopping the process before you're bringing that information to the people whose tax dollars funded that work, you're doing society a disservice. And so I think right now the incentive structure is not set up in such a way that there's any reason for, besides just personal motivation or interest, to spend a lot of time doing that sort of public dissemination. But you could very easily build that incentive structure in, whether it is, there are two things you need to get between a scientist and either their tenure or their grant money. And if you're standing between them and that, if you need to be tweeting or writing blog posts or giving public talks to get funded or to get tenure, they'll do it.
Right.
So we could definitely see a different sort of system where, like you're saying, each scientist is a public figure in a way on their own topic and is comfortable in speaking in that sort of setting. That definitely is a best case scenario I think we should work towards.
Right, and I think the social media platforms themselves can change their algorithms, so it's not just about what's the most popular, but it's also about what's the most reliable. And they've sort of held back on making those sort of distinctions because they don't really want the responsibility oftentimes. But there have been some talk of Twitter creating sort of like an open source code of their algorithm. So anyone can use their algorithm or suggest a different algorithm that maybe rather than valuing, the number of retweets or outrage or whatever, they value the number of replies from other reputable sources or likes only from other reputable sources. Or, there are many ways that you can adjust the algorithm to change what rises to the top. So I feel confident that it is possible, especially if more reliable people are actually engaging on these social platforms. But it is going to take a cultural shift, both on the part of scientists and on the part of social media, platforms to change how they operate. Well, let's bring it home with the most likely scenario. What do you think is most likely to happen in the next, 10, 20 years?
Most likely scenario.
Yeah, I do think in many ways we're at a pretty, active, pivotal crossroads in this sort of arena. On the one hand, I think we are perhaps more than ever susceptible to the things we were talking about in the worst case scenario in terms of the sharing of information on social media. I don't see a trend that's necessarily reversing the noisiness or the spread of misinformation. I don't think it'll necessarily take over immediately, but it's going to be a challenge to deal with that. But I'm encouraged by things that I see, especially like I was saying earlier in the transparency of scientific publishing and the effort and the desire of people to not just share pieces of information as one-off facts, but actually share the thought process and actually lay bare what goes into generating a fact and all of the uncertainty associated with it. If we can just take the next step basically towards not just doing that within the context of your own scientific journal, but basically doing this outwardly facing the public all the time, that would be great. And I think that's well within reach for a likely scenario within the time scale of a decade or two. So I think we could expect to see scientific publishing steadily move in that direction. And I think both that world and the social media information world have complementary things to learn from each other about how they should and should not approach the sharing of information.
Yeah.
Just some thoughts.
Yeah, I would say for my most likely, oftentimes when I'm considering the most likely, I'll think about how are the younger generations behaving? Because that's often a good sign for how future generations will behave. And I feel pretty optimistic about the future of knowledge when I look at how, millennials and Gen Zs respond to conspiracy theories as opposed to, say, baby boomers or the greatest generation. Because I feel like when you grow up in a digital native environment, your bullshit detector is just calibrated to a whole nother level than if you grew up in the era of newspapers and Walter Cronkite and now you're being hit from every angle with every persuasion tactic. You're just simply not going to have as good a defenses as someone who's been, pressing buttons on an iPad since day one. So I think that the quality of information will go up over time. I think people will get better at combating misinformation. I think that the nature of just any profession is going to be more ingrained with the information economy, the attention economy. So I think it makes sense to predict that scientists will have a more public-facing role in the future. So I feel pretty optimistic about this, but it's definitely not something we can sit idly by and just hope that it works out because when you're talking about something like the future of knowledge, the future of information, any other scenario we care about, whether it's the planet or pandemics or space travel or anything else we want to achieve, it's super critical that we all have the same set of facts that we can agree on. And then from there, we can just decide how do we want to interpret the facts so that we can make the best path forward for ourselves and our species and our planet.
Absolutely. So I agree with you. Reason for hopefulness that with challenges notwithstanding, there's a lot of encouraging potential with this new means of sharing information rapidly. So I agree.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Kipp, for taking the time. And thank you to our listeners. This has been The Future of Knowledge. And we'll see you next time.
The past, the present, and the